Hello and greetings, everyone, and welcome to our second event of the spring semester. We have a very impressive group of scholars, part of this special panel, and I will shortly explain the format and introduce our speakers today. But let me just pause for a moment and just remind you that our next event is scheduled for April 7th, which is, as normally we have our events, is a Thursday at 12:30 at lunchtime. The April 7th event is a discussion of a new book, Feeding Iran, Shia Families and Making of the Islamic Republic. This is a new book by Rose Wellman of the Michigan University, and I hope you are all able to join us for these particular events. Our two discussants for these events are Maryam Allamzadeh and of Princeton currently, and Mehdi Faraji of New York University. Let me briefly introduce our discussants and say a few words about this panel, and then turn it to the real leaders of this panel. My role is really to welcome you and just give you a list of scholars. This particular panel that has a format similar to what we usually call research workshop has been organized by Kaveh Ehsani and Bita Musavi, and they will discuss and explain the idea and the format of the panel. But let me remind those of you who regularly attend our meetings is that this is really a second session of our capitalism, writing capitalism in Iran. The first panel was scheduled in the fall, and Kaveh and Shima and Bita participated in that panel. Unfortunately, K1 was sick, but now we have all of those back, and K1 looks very vibrant and even younger than usual, and also a larger group of scholars. This is a really and genuinely multidisciplinary scholars that we will be discussing the writing about capitalism in Iran. Because we are short of time, I only share with you their names and affiliations, but you would realize how interdisciplinary this workshop is. Kaveh Ehsani is a professor of international studies at DePaul University in Chicago. Kevin Harris, that I mentioned, is a professor of sociology in UCLA. Shima Hoshyar is a anthropology a scholar and a PhD candidate at Graduate Center here in New York, although I am really in Washington, D.C. Kamran Mateen is a professor of international relations, is in Sussex University in UK. Our colleague Rudy Mati, who is teaching at this moment, but in 15 minutes will join us, is a historian of early modern Iran from the University of Delaware. Muhammad Malju is our colleague, or our only colleague based in Iran, a Tehran-based independent researcher. I'm sure that all our scholars are also independent, as well as having affiliations. Maziar Samei, a PhD candidate and researcher in global political economy from University of Sussex, and our own Bita Mousavi, a PhD candidate at NYU. Thank you all for being part of this panel, and thank you, Bita and Kaveh, for organizing this. I look forward to hearing from everyone, and now I turn it to you, Kaveh.
No, thank you, Ali. Thank you very much. I really want to express my appreciation to Ali Mirsepasi, Gevorkian Center, the Iranian Studies Initiative at NYU for hosting this event. As Ali said, this is the second event we're hosting on, that is being hosted by NYU on this topic. And just kind of to give you a little bit of a background and explanation about this format. The editor of Iranian Studies, Susan Siavashi, asked me to kind of, brainstorm and maybe come up with an idea of a roundtable for the journal Iranian Studies. And I thought this theme that was initially proposed by Bita Mousavi was a really appropriate one as an inaugural roundtable section in Iranian Studies, to bring a theme and propose a kind of a paradigm for analysis in the journal, in a journal that is, all of us read. It's the key journal in our field, and the editor felt, I feel that an intervention into critical social sciences and critical social theory, in the journal is a very timely intervention. And really, this is a panel that Bita and I have organized together, and we will be editing it jointly. And the idea was to ask a number of scholars, invite a number of scholars who are kind of looking at capitalism and using capitalism as an analytical category to analyze, the contemporary Iran, to kind of reflect on two key questions. One is capitalism an operative category for understanding and analyzing contemporary Iran? And when I say contemporary Iran, obviously, our colleague Rudy Mate is a historian of, primarily the greatest historian of the Safavid era and early modern era. So we really mean, and we have other historians. My own work is very historical at present, so we're not kind of limiting it to the present day when we say contemporary, but modern Iranian history. To what extent capitalism is a category, an analytical category that can explain, social, political, cultural, material, everyday lives of society. And the second question we posed, and our colleagues will be kind of discussing, is, okay, if capitalism is a useful category and an important category for understanding and explaining contemporary Iran, then how do you use it in your own work? What is the method? What is, in what ways is it being deployed to kind of frame modern and contemporary Iran, right? So the composition of obviously we could have reached out to many others. The point is that, as you can see, we have a panel that is half-half, constitutes of younger scholars, older scholars. I guess myself, I'm now within that category, and students, right? So like from different generations and different fields of analysis, we have a number of voices that will kind of share their perspective and their ideas briefly. Obviously, because of the format and because that's what a roundtable is. It's just like proposing a method of analysis and looking. It's just very programmatic in that way. We can't really go into details. our works go into those details, right? But we can make a statement here. Now, what is why is this a question? I mean, why frame it like this? I think a lot of, from my perspective, and maybe some disagree, I think there's a sense among many scholars of Iran and the way that contemporary Iranian society and political economy are analyzed, there's a sense that there's, Iran is really exceptional. That because of the prevalence and the scale and size of the formal state sector, because of geopolitics, because of the regimes of sanctions and the relative isolation of Iran from global networks of trade and interaction, and the ideological nature of the current ruling regime, all of that makes Iran an exception. And really, capitalism is not a way of explaining it, because capitalism, after all, is part of a global system of political economy and modes of regulations and reproduction of material life. The second reason is that, it seems that if one follows a lot of the analyses of contemporary Iran, especially a lot of work produced in Iran, I think with very few exceptions, Mohammad Malju being a very kind of one of those exceptions, the category of social class seems to be inoperative. For various reasons, various explanations given, but we actually have a whole literature that makes the claim that because of the scale of informality, because of the precarity of labor relations and people's positions in material life and economic life, social class is no longer an operative category. And, so it really cannot be deployed. So I think in the past, since the revolution, but even before that, I think the kind of the way of thinking about capitalism and actually using it as a category for explaining politics and material life in Iran has been kind of open to questioning. And we thought that in this panel, we have an opportunity to actually kind of address this a little bit more directly and allow our participants to kind of engage with this question, with these two questions that I posed. Everyone that is participating here has been really kind of a pioneer producing fantastic work, or at the stage of their scholarship that they're really coming up with innovative and sharp and critical ideas. But all of them, one way or another, do engage these two questions that I posed. So we look forward to having this conversation. Vita, it's yours.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think, you essentially covered, I was just responding to a message from Kamran. But I think you've covered the sort of motivating, the questions and themes that have brought us together. And, I think for me, my interest in these questions has been sort of, it's motivated by conversations I've had about sort of again, as you touched on, the peculiarity of not just Iran, but many sort of global South economies, right? And arriving at an understanding of capitalism that is both useful in sort of understanding these contexts, but also doesn't lose some of the historical specificity that makes the concept worth talking about, right? And I think Kayvon's comments will touch on that. And so I'm really here to limit myself to asking some questions that will hopefully trigger a conversation between the participants. So I'll hand it over to you, Kayvon, and I'll be keeping time as well. So I'll let you know, but floor is yours.
Okay, thanks to Kaveh and Bita, and thanks to Ali and NYU. And I had been scheduled to part one of this panel, and I mistakenly got my COVID booster. Although it's a luxury that I get the COVID booster, but it put me out. So I missed the last panel. So it was a great panel, and I thank you for inviting me again. Second, since we're announcing things, we're going to be holding a conference at UCLA in February 2023 on the Iranian diaspora in global perspective, global comparative historical perspective. It's a kind of attempt to bring studies of Iranian migration, cultural production, and organization, historical modes of migration, in conversation with large other migration experiences and diasporas. And I'm putting a call for abstracts in the comments, the chat for this group, and then people who are watching can look it up at UCLA's site. Okay. All right. So I want to make this. We have to keep our comments short because there's so many illustrious minds here. So I'll keep it very, very short. I just want to remind everyone here of a kind of a stylized social fact of economic history, which is that over the past 200 years, so not just post-war, post-colonialism, over the past 200 years, basically less than 10 non-Western countries have become high-income, successful capitalist developed countries. Japan, Korea, Taiwan. If we include Russia, not in the West, as it seems some people like to do today, Russia, and then Israel, let's not forget Israel, and then basically city-states like Singapore, and we can include some of the Gulf states, depending on, we can be as liberal as we want, so the Gulf states include. So in that sense, the kind of economic trajectory of Iran over the last 200 years is actually quite common. However, one of the ways, probably one of the most common ways in which capitalism as an analytical category has been used in Iranian studies and Iranian historiography is by pathologizing Iranian history to figure out what went wrong. What elements that existed in some model of capitalist development, often, Europe is a model or a stylized version of European history, is compared to Iranian history, and Iranian history is found wanting, deviant, lacking, the absence of things rather than the presence of things, no merchant autonomy from the state, no autonomous middle class, no civil society, no public sphere with democratic culture, right? And so it's often an explanation via the negatives, the absence of something. And it's very common, and it returns every generation. The question is posed every generation. New theories fill into this question, whether it's a particular version of, third world Marxism, or a kind of, the prior versions of kind of libertarian anti-statist thought, or today a very popular mode of argument in Iran is that it's some combination of bad institutions which lead to quote unquote rent seeking, right? Very popular. Of course, this is also the most popular theory in mainstream economics around the world. So again, Iran is not unique in that. So I would say that this is a very common way, and even if capitalism doesn't speak its own name, the pathologization of Iranian history, the search for absences, and really the methodological nationalism of this question is quite common and repeats itself over and over again. By methodological nationalism, I mean that the unit of analysis in which things happen, either cause or don't cause capitalism to happen, are internal to some type of territorial unit. That's either the Persian Empire or later the Iranian nation state. So that's not going to go away. If people want to continue to engage in that research program, I would recommend scholars and students to read the highly revisionist historiography of Europe that's been produced over the last 20, 30 years, which makes many authors make the argument that our original accounts of European exceptionalism, autonomous middle classes, capitalist dynamism and innovation, they might not be as unique or as present in the way that we previously assumed. So we probably need to read more of European history to understand Iranian history. Could be one way to do it. Now let's switch to a very different type of thinking about capitalism that's quite common. No, not quite common. It's less common, and we have Kamran Matiner, whose book, Recasting Iranian Modernity, I think is just a fantastic book. It's a book that makes you rethink the historiography of Iran. And the perspective of that book, and of course I'll let him speak for himself, but the perspective of that book I see more widely utilized, which is that that thinking of capitalism, as Kaveh said, as a kind of global system in which networks of trade and commodity production and ideas and organizational emulation are all link processes that occur inside of Iran with processes that occur outside of Iran. So I think often we can think of dissertations which find particular types of commodities in Iran, and those commodities are linked to forms of production in other parts of the world, and Iran is therefore linked to the rest of the world. It's part of a global story of capitalist modernity. And whether one wants to prescribe a positive thing to this or a negative connotation, that nevertheless, it's a way of connecting historical change in Iran with historical change outside of Iran. And this is, for example, think about the work on infrastructure in Iran, work on, the recent book on the trains. We can think of work on, obviously, the oil sector and how patterns of organization, economic organization, and labor actually look very similar in Iran as they do to other places. So this is a kind of mode of argumentation that says actually Iran has a lot in common with the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is capitalist, last time we checked. So these things must be capitalist in many ways. And here's why this matters. And I think this is a very productive and exciting way of using historiography in Iran to link and analogize change in Iran over time and space with places elsewhere. The danger of this approach is probably twofold, just in my opinion, twofold. One is that finding more and more connections, entanglements, linkages between processes in Iran and processes outside, it's fine, but we need even more theory, not less theory, to understand which of these networks, which of these connections are leading to the outcomes that we're interested in. If we're interested in, let's say, particular periods of growth or particular types of economic growth, we actually have to be even more careful about which connections we find as causally important, right? As opposed to just everything is connected, because it truly is in the sense of the term. So it actually requires more theory, not less. And the second is the conflation of capitalism and modernity, right? Both of those terms are highly abstract and used and abused. But there are many huge scale, high modernist projects in Iranian 20th century history, which look like, resemble in many ways high modernist projects in places that we might not want to consider capitalist, like the Soviet Union. So labeling something capitalist is probably not doing much explanatory work when we're labeling things like land reform, dam construction, urbanization. Just labeling it capitalist alone doesn't explain anything. In fact, it probably prevents us from explaining things at times. So those are the kind of pitfalls of the different historiographical moves that are both, I think, kind of dueling in Iranian historiography, and both have produced interesting debates. And I think we should return to these debates. I mean, let's just debate this stuff. And then, third is the kind that I, used a bit for my book and for various side projects on understanding change in Iran. First is to basically, I think, actually existing capitalism. So not capitalism as it should exist, but capitalism as at least as actually exists. So let's take a look at what actually exists in Iran, as opposed to pathologize it and say that, oh, it should have been something else. And understand from a perspective that, as a late developer state, whether, late 19th century imperial politics or 20th century national politics, economic and social policies by both the state and other powerful actors in Iran have often been involved in attempts to catch up with wealthier countries, emulating, competing with, and intervening in social life in Iran. And this causes change. This is related to change. So I think studying lowering the unit of analysis beyond lower than the nation state or the national economy, and looking at actors that relate to these processes of attempts to catch up may provide us with ways of seeing Iran in a useful way and ways of comparing Iran. So for example, I have a whole project on business groups in Iran, conglomerates, holders of capital, state-owned enterprises. And instead of pathologize them and say that, oh, in a modern country, businesses shouldn't look like this, we should actually say that actually business groups, huge business groups like they exist in Iran today that are linked to the state, probably one of the most common forms of economic actor in the global South today, and a lot of the global North. So it's not that uncommon. Similarly, a social class stratification, modes of household reproduction that occur in Iran. These are quite common in almost all of the global South and large parts of the global North. So to pathologize them as somehow they shouldn't be there, or something's going wrong, right, is a heuristic that I think often gets in the way. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully I made it broad enough so other people can often comment on it as well. So thanks for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to everyone else's comments.
Shima, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to Bita Kaveh and Ali and everyone else at Kevorkian for organizing this, bringing us all together. So my contribution to this panel on this question of capitalism is to actually look at the role of nature and technology in the capitalist processes in the 20th century. So I actually want to argue that, you know, we take seriously the fact that we cannot separate human from non-human relations, or another way of putting that is nature from society. So I started thinking of capitalism kind of more as this mode of organizing and producing nature, which actually includes not just biophysical things, but also the social relations that we see. And so one of the things that we can see actually throughout the history of capitalism, and I think we see in Iran as well, is that there's a sort of process of, you know, a simplification of the relations that exist between, you know, nature and labor and, you know, human social processes, and also humans' metabolic relations with nature. So in order to get at this, I look at the role of, you know, technologies and infrastructures that can make possible the enrollment of the work of nature into processes of production and consumption. So one way of understanding this is to say that, you know, it's not so much that capitalism, you know, just produces negative environmental consequences, let's say, which it does. But actually to think of like, how does capitalism itself emerge from rearranging this entire matrix of, you know, natural social relations? So I'm basically making an argument for like looking at the environment and nature to understand capitalism. But it's also important to note that, again, capitalism is this unfolding, unfinished project, right? So it's constantly facing all sorts of resistances, barriers, contradictions that it has to overcome. So it's always going to be subjected to unintended consequences of its own making. And so by looking at you know, how technologies are integrated, or looking at these natural processes or human, you know, social labor, let's say, we can also find actually within those processes points of you know, points in the production and social reproduction process where capitalism could also be challenged. And we can talk about this, you know, more in the discussion if people are interested. So in a way, this means that we kind of have to pay attention to kind of spatial geographies, like how capitalism unfolds across space, how it unfolds through uneven development, so that we can see how value is, you know, extracted and appropriated both from labor, but also from non-human work, so the work of nature, which, as we have, I think we have discussed last time, you know, it leads to different kinds of inequalities, dispossession, etc. So in the last panel, last semester, you know, I focused mostly on the industrialization of Iran's agriculture, particularly in Khuzestan, through, you know, these joint foreign Iranian agribusinesses and the state-owned farm corporations that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. So one of the things that I talked about last time was that through these large-scale infrastructures like dams and roads and irrigation canals and all the things that Kevin was saying, there are actually material ways that these big industries can simplify that matrix of social natural relations and redirect the value and work of nature toward the accumulation of profit. So for today, I was thinking specifically actually about electricity as, you know, one avenue through which to look at this. And I know this is very granular and we're trying to think of like big ideas. But I actually think electrical production and consumption is a very interesting way of thinking about this uneven development, just as an example, precisely because throughout the 20th century, it became this, you know, it actually became one of the indicators of economic growth. It sort of became a stand-in for economic growth and development across the world. So it actually kind of, by following these infrastructures, you can also see like where industrialization and growth are unfolding across space. And to notice that, for example, prior to the 1950s, Iran's electricity was mostly private, it was very expensive, it was very unreliable. So state control over electrification actually produced or ensured that cheap electricity and reliable power could be produced. So this is actually a way to you know, expand industrialization and promote the emergence of these medium and large manufacturing across Iran, which mostly occurred throughout the 20th century. It was also very integral to industrial agriculture and food, you know, expansion of food processing centers, so creating cheap food for the newly urbanized, you know, proletariat labor class in Iran. And again, to add to this, like if we think of electricity as this thing that has to be produced and consumed immediately, it's also another way to connect this process of industrialization, proletarianization to the extraction of natural resources. So whether that's natural gas, solar, hydroelectricity, coal, etc. In many ways, I think it's actually kind of similar to when people look at, for example, oil or oil pipelines, right? So the way that oil pipelines can transfer, right, like the natural resource from one place to another, you know, these electrical transmission lines kind of did the same thing where, you know, power and value is extracted from one place and is actually transferred outside of these, a lot of these peripheral provinces like Khuzestan going to more central provinces. Meanwhile, people who live within the vicinity of those power plants or hydroelectric dams, etc., were left without electricity in the 20th century or before the revolution. So this is just one example of like how we can use these, looking at these processes to kind of investigate the spatiality of this kind of development, not just in terms of proletarianization of labor or production of commodities, but also how nature is being produced, how the work of nature is being appropriated and expropriated, you know, toward different kinds of accumulation. So I guess to quickly wrap up, because I don't want to take too much time, but I do think the question that Keyvan raised is very important. Like, how do we differentiate between like high modernity and capitalism? Like, do they go together? You know, what are the differences between them? I mean, I think what I would sort of say to that is that it's not so much that technology and modernity are equivalent to capitalism, right? I don't think that's what we are saying, but more that, you know, capitalism is that social political process in which technologies are embedded to create more extractive processes, to appropriate more value, and also to bring the cost of social reproduction down for capital, which I think social reproduction then becomes kind of an interesting way or interesting avenue through which to investigate capitalism, not just the production of commodities. But where I do take seriously, you know, technology and nature is that if we take them seriously as actual objects that exist in the world, like actual material objects, then we have to also take seriously that they have their own affordances, they have their own logics that, while yes, can be appropriated by capitalist processes and are embedded in it, they also sort of operate according to their own logic. that could potentially exceed or challenge the very system that produced them to begin with. So like I said, I do want to make an argument that actually looking at these infrastructures could be a way to get at some of these development processes, less so that they are, equivalent to each other. Okay, I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Shima. Mohammed, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Let me read the text I have already written for this webinar. I take capitalism as an analytical category into account while trying to see to what extent the most important prerequisites of capital accumulation in Iranian post-revolutionary economy have been met. Considering accumulation of capital as a process rather than a mere act of transformation of surplus value into capital, I have constructed a conceptual framework to map the 6 interwoven necessary structural conditions of possibility for accumulating capital in the post-revolutionary Iran. So I see the post-revolutionary political economy as interactions between 6 intertwined conceptual moments. First, appropriation through dispossession in such a way as to massively concentrate the economic resources in the hands of the minority members of the society as the main agents of capital accumulation. Second, appropriation through exploitation of labor, which requires the availability of some assured reserve of cheap and obedient labor power. Third, exploitation of nature, which requires the accessibility of some sufficient cheap stock of various environmental resources. Fourth, allocation of the economic resources to various production or productive or unproductive economic activities. Fifth, formation of effective demand for commodities of domestic sectors in the national and international commodity markets. And finally, sixth, the very act of transformation of surplus value into capital in outside or inside of the national borders. The first 3 conceptual moments is the reflection of vertical interclass relations, but the second 3, the reflection of horizontal intra-class relations within the ruling class. Based on such conceptual framework, I put forward a twofold hypothesis. Insofar as the vertical interclass power relations between differentiated upper and lower classes are concerned, the prerequisites are highly met in such a way as to successfully create a high degree of commodification of both labor power and environmental resources as the common backbone of a variety of historical capitalisms everywhere. While insofar as the horizontal intra-class relations within the upper social classes are concerned, the prerequisites are poorly met in such a way as to seriously make a hindrance in the path of capitalist production. Deeply intertwined with such historically constructed class configuration, capitalism has continued to increasingly unfold in post-revolutionary Iran with 2 simultaneous contradictory characteristics, that is, the ever-strengthening capitalist class relations accompanied by ever-weakening capitalist production. How can such an economy survive when these 2 contradictory characteristics continually threaten its viability? Also, how can such an economy with its ever-weakening capitalist production be partly incorporated into the global capitalism? The answer for both questions should be searched in the roles played by oil export revenues in the Iranian economy. Until recently, I mean before the beginning of the severe international economic sanction, Iranian post-revolutionary economy was able to survive mostly by relying on the cushioning effect of oil export revenues, which was usually to partly fix its structural crisis by compensating to some extent for the deficient and ever weaker capitalist production in non-oil sectors. In addition to such national-oriented cushioning effect, the oil export revenues also had an international-oriented integrating effect, which explains the way in which the Iranian economy continued to increasingly incorporate into the global capitalism. The oil export revenues were entering into the national economy mainly through the state budget, then mostly exiting from the national economy through two outways of first, the negative non-oil current account balance, and second, the negative capital account balance. The appropriation of surplus value by both dispossession and exploitation entirely was occurring in the domestic economy, but because of a high degree of capital flight, the act of transformation of the appropriated surplus value into capital, that is capital accumulation, mostly was occurring in the global economy. Based on this way of formulating capitalism in post-revolutionary Iran, I like to separate my approach from two opposed but equally extremist camps in the field of Iranian studies. In the one camp, having compared neoliberal capitalism in the context of the global north with the Iranian political economy, which suffers from a lack of both political liberalism and robust economy, the extremist underestimators hold that neoliberal capitalism has no material reality in Iran, without being able to explain the continuous reproduction of classically capitalist class relations in Iranian society. In the other camp, having failed to rise to the historical level of analysis, the extremist overestimators analyze basic structures of the Iranian economy entirely within an explanatory framework which can only be used for abstract analysis of the logic of capital alone, without explicitly noticing the facticity of weakness of capitalist production in Iranian economy. I deploy capitalism as an analytical category in my work in such a way as to capture both potency of capitalist class relations and impotency of capitalist production in the post-revolutionary Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, all three of you. So I'm going to make an attempt now to just start a conversation, hopefully as much between me and the three of you as between all the participants present here. And I think the three of you bring some of the questions that I think are motivating this workshop to the fore, right? Which is, you know, there's the work of defining capitalism, and we can do so with great precision, but that's never going to quite take the place of historical explanation either, right? For some of the reasons that you guys point to. Shima, for instance, argues that, you know, capitalism itself throws up continual barriers to its own reproduction. There are the vagaries of nature and ecology. And many of the sort of standard definitions of capitalism we work with just don't quite take that into account. Or, as Mohammed was arguing, if we look to Iran only to confirm this sort of preconceived logic of capitalism, its laws of motion and so on, we might overlook some of the distinct differences and crisis tendencies that he's pointing out. But definitions and conceptual categories are, of course, important, right? And color the conclusions that we draw, which is, I think, partly why we've gathered here today. So starting with Kayvon, I was hoping we could just probe some of the implications of the theories that I think you guys put forward with varying degrees of commitment to a little further. Kayvon, you never quite took a stance in terms of which of these definitions you might sort of favor, but I get the sense that you gravitate towards a sort of a more limited, restricted definition of capitalism, right? If capitalism can be anything, then it's sort of its utility, its conceptual significance is escaped from it. So I'm wondering then the more sort of historically limited specific definitions of capitalism that then come to mind for me are, you know, capitalism is this distinct mode of production, characterized, of course, by sort of an attendant set of social property relations. But you seem to also harbor a lot of sort of ill feeling towards this internalist approach, right? Which opens the door potentially to some of the sort of pathologizing analyses that you discuss. So I'm wondering how you then reconcile these two things, your appreciation on the one hand for a very historically specific and limited definition of capitalism with some of these logical consequences, right? Which is if we're too formalistic about what capitalism is, then we run the risk of drawing these sort of negative comparisons. So that's one question. And I think Shima and Mohammed, I think your guys' presentation brings up another question we're collectively facing, right? Which is, how do we begin to conceptualize capitalism in the face of tremendous internal and regional variation, right? I think it's easy to sort of say like this internalist approach has pitfalls, but I think Shima, for instance, you're talking about like, well, what does it even mean to talk about something internally when there is this tremendous amount of sort of unevenness to what we might take to be internal, right? So I'm wondering, while your attention to Khuzestan helps us understand how capitalism has been very unevenly spatialized within Iran, at least in the past century, my question for you is, how do we get from Khuzestan to anywhere else? Do you see a story about the general culture of capitalism is at play here? Which is to sort of, to put this question in broader terms, if we're trying to define capitalism, are we even aiming for a universal definition? Or is the very point of some of these more historically oriented efforts to localize it, to get it to meet the sort of particularities of time and place? But then what is then the broader conceptual utility of that very definition? So that's just a problem that I'm working through, and I would be interested to hear what you all have to say about that. And I think, Mohammed, I'm thinking of you as well when I'm posing this question, because I think you would sort of make an argument through, in some ways, negative comparison, right? Which we've sort of talked about as having potential pitfalls attached to it, right? You describe capitalist production in Iran as weak, yet certain sort of class relations is successful in their commodification of labor and nature. So I'm wondering if all of you could also maybe potentially comment on what role comparison plays in how you begin to approach some of these questions, or what role it ought to play. So those are just some questions. I'm happy to repeat any of them, but I would also be really delighted to hear from other participants and their thoughts on these three presentations. Thank you.
Are we going in order again? You're the director.
Whoever, if you got a thought that jumped to mind hearing any of those, I'd be happy to hear it. And you guys can just feel free to unmute yourselves, but
Yeah, just keep in mind that given limited time, we have 10 minutes for this conversation.
And
you don't have to say it. Yeah.
Hopefully more time to revisit at the end, but we would like to give the next three presenters their fair share of time as well.
Well, I'll just say that the bad use of history is abstracting out of historical change at one time or one place to such an extent to where one takes this kind of cookie cutter and it then kind of slams it down on other parts of history. Says it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. And I would say that's bad use of kind of historiography to link to big theories, including theories of capitalism and theories of capitalist transition. So I am wary of that, and there's a mode of both folk in the vernacular way that Iranians compare their what they think has occurred in their own history or in their country's history to other parts of the world where this is quite common. Of course, it's common in most countries. It's nothing unique to Iran. So I would say that actually existing capitalism, or sometimes called historical capitalism, means that we have to pay attention to those configurations of social, economic, and political organizations that wherever they were in the world economy, reorganize things to an extent to drive capital accumulation. And that can include things like accumulation by dispossession, political extraction, all the things that Omid, were mentioning. And it can include, advances in the productivity of labor, changes in geopolitical and geoeconomic organization, obviously all kinds of spatial shifts in organizational production. So these are all can be present when looking at when examining, how we think capitalism changes places over time. However, Iran might not be in the middle of any of these processes. The unit of analysis gets in the way often. If we're looking for capitalism, like especially the main drivers of capitalism, they don't stay in the same place over time. I mean, that's at least my opinion and many theorists' opinion. So if we want to look at that, we should follow that and not necessarily be limited by the national container of Iran. However, we're interested in how do big processes affect class structure, the modes of household reproduction, gender relations, rural-urban dynamics. Then we should be looking at those and asking, what comes in and changes these, and at what time, and how. So I'm ruthlessly pragmatic, and obviously that can be very frustrating for some people who don't like pragmatists.
I guess I can maybe quickly respond to your question. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, maybe we talked about this in the last panel, but I think the focus on Khuzestan just came out of, I mean, the historical question that a lot of the experiments that were being done, whether it was oil or, industrialization of agriculture, a lot of those experimental models were started in Khuzestan. So that's sort of like the beginning. But of course, that's not to say that they don't exist in other provinces in Iran, or that Khuzestan is just like the only place, or it's somehow unique. But I think it's interesting that today we see part of the struggles that we see people in Iran today. A lot of it is, of course, there are labor struggles, right? So, like Haftape is one of them, or Fulad Ahvaz, and like all of these places. But there are also real struggles against people's inability to socially reproduce themselves, whether because of environmental problems, right? So in Khuzestan, we see this as well, that families cannot provide for themselves, basically, right? And maybe, I'm not sure, maybe this also ties to what Mohammad Malju was saying about the weakening of production, of capitalist production. So I think it's worth it to look at these kind of more localized instances of, where are these struggles happening? And to, instead of trying to come up with like a universalized definition of capitalism, but try to understand how are those capitalist processes actually, what are the consequences of that in the local context? And also to realize that even if people don't necessarily, let's say struggle for a clean environment, I mean, nobody thinks of that necessarily as an anti-capitalist struggle, but I think those are sort of points where people are asserting a kind of like autonomy, or I don't know, like political representation over how they think their environment should be organized, right? That maybe it shouldn't be organized around extraction of profit by these large conglomerates. So it's that, I think that's why looking at the local context matters, not so much that just to say that Khuzestan is unique.
Kaveh, would you like to make a comment?
I would, but unless Omid wants to go first.
So it's my turn, I think.
It's not a turn if you don't want to, you want to save your comment.
I want to tell a not so important point. Let me limit my argument only to Iran, as usual. For defining and explaining historical capitalism in Iran, I think we should consider its both similarities with and differences from other historical capitalisms in other geographies, countries, or indeed other experiences. In a general analysis, I think the most important similarities between Iranian historical capitalism with others are the more or less same capitalist class relations in every historical capitalism, which are manifested in the commodification of labor power and environmental resources. Every society, I think, every society which has these two kinds of commodification, at least in my definition, should be considered capitalistic. Of course, there are so many differences between various historical capitalisms, but what is common between all of them is exactly these two characteristics: commodification of labor power and commodification of environmental resources, which allow to logic of capital partly be functional. At the same time, the most important difference between historical capitalism in Iran with other capitalism in the context of, for example, and particularly global north, is the impotency and weakness of production in general and capitalist production in particular in Iran. We should consider both differences and similarities without being in trap of exceptionalism for Iranian economy, be it pre-revolutionary or post-revolutionary. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, I share points with a lot of the commentators. You know what you said. I mean, like Shima, my work is, a lot of it is on Khuzestan too, and I want to draw this attention. Maybe kind of problematize some of the comments by that Kayvan made and Omid made. How do we define a place, or how do we think about a place like Masjid Suleiman in Khuzestan, which is a dead space? It's a sacrifice zone by now, right? I mean, oil was extracted, oil capitalism took shape there, like a British Empire fought its war, the First World War, based on Masjid Suleiman oil, and was victorious. It kind of allowed this transition to on a global scale to Fordism, to internal combustion engine, kind of like generated the whole kind of shift to oil capitalism throughout the Persian Gulf and Middle East, and is a dead zone, right? It's a shell of its place. It's the garbage left over from capitalist production. How do we define these spaces? Do we say that they're not, because nobody can get employment, because it's just a place that is full of refugees and it's polluted, and it's the after effect and the leftover carcass of extractive capitalism, that is not part of that political economy of mode of organizing life? I mean, there's a chain that goes from extraction to production, consumption, and then to waste. I mean, their nature, what Shima was mentioning about, like this, like questioning this nature society divide. How do we think about nature that has been used as a resource, like an abandoned pit, open pit mine, in outback Australia? I mean, that is the footmark of capitalist extraction, because no other kind of extraction would be like this, would look like this, would treat and commodify, people, landscape. It just wouldn't have the ability to do it, to marshal resources and, technology and expertise, science and technology, to kind of like commodify and like think and justify based on the profit motive. And by profit motive, I don't mean just private companies, but, states saying that, look, like we can justify this because we're increasing the GDP. We're all of this, the fact of capitalism is that it organizes, aside from what Omid was saying, in addition to what Omid was saying, commodifying labor and land, it's also about commodifying money. I mean, the entirety of social interactions are monetized. The only measure of common value that we have is money, it's the market, right? So in that context, whether one is working in a factory, or if a teacher is kind of having a salary, or retirement money, pension money and all that, everything is being mediated through the medium of money and the market and quantification of value through this. This is the one measure of value that we have. Morality, social commitments, a sense of, a moral economy. All of those are, if they are being sidelined and replaced by, a money economy, I mean, for me, it is very difficult to think, what is, what other factor than capitalism can explain this. And if nothing is valued through money, like, the spaces, for example, left over by oil, the detritus of capitalism, they can't be valued. They're worth nothing. They're worthless, including the people living there. That is also, part of that circuit of, capitalism, as a set of social relationships and as a set of natural relationships. So I think, like, we can cast our net a little bit wider than just kind of looking at networks of, how the economy and infrastructure and projects work. The after effects of that should be part of our calculation as much as, the circuits of circulation and production and consumption.
Can I just say two things? First, the exclusionary or the post valuation moment of capitalism is extremely important and is often left right out. So I agree with you. In fact, huge swaths of the world economy are essentially unlinked, or involuntarily delinked from big networks of exchange in the global north. It's not that the North exploits the South, is that they don't, or that's what Joan Robbins says, that they don't exploit it enough. So the waste that comes after the process, I totally agree. So I think it's very fine to understand that. I would also caution us, however, to not conflate plan with market or plan with socialism market with capitalism. This is the problem of searching for capitalism in our ancient histories. Every nationalist historiography does this. We had markets, we had merchants, we had commodities, we had transformation of nature, we had surplus extraction into imperial pockets. We had wage labor. These are things that have occurred in imperial histories, non-Western imperial histories. But so the danger of the expansionary eye is to suck all of this into a story. That these two have been capitalist, and it's a fine point to make, but I'm not sure to what extent that, at least in a historiographical sense, is explanatory. That's my two mild points.
I think we should move on to the next section.
Okay, I feel like there's a lot left to say about that, so hopefully we can just pin it for later. But next up we have Professor Kamran Mateen. So whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Right. Hi everyone. I would also like to start by thanking Kaveh, Bita, Ali, James, who I think is the invisible technician behind the scenes, Susan, who is the also invisible hand behind this forum, it seems, and also for everyone who is here. I also want to thank Kevin for very generous treatment of my work in his talk, as well as in the short statement which we pre-circulated before the event. In fact, I was asking Bita whether that statement which we were asked to produce was circulated to everyone or just the speakers, and it turns out it's just the speakers have seen it, because I had prepared my talks on the basis that everybody has read the statement. So I wanted to be very brief and simply respond to some of the points raised by the other papers. So because of that, I'm going to try to be very spontaneous and just summarize the summary of the position statement we were asked to produce, with the caveat that I have actually got COVID. If Kevin got the vaccine for the COVID, I have got actually the COVID itself. So it's very likely that halfway through I'm starting coughing into the mic, which will, I think, annoy everybody, in which case just tell me shut up and I will stop. So basically, we all come from different disciplinary positions. I am trained as a historical sociologist in an IR department, which is notorious for being over-theoretical and very, very historically problematic, the discipline of IR, I mean. But my historical sociological kind of sensibility makes my work rather broad and general. In that sense, I feel a little bit of an imposter because I really don't have the kind of detailed empirical information that other panelists and participants have about specifically Iranian experience of capitalism. But since actually the question of exceptionalism was an organizing theme of this panel, I thought that actually my broad theoretical kind of engagement with this question of capitalism and capitalist modernity might still be relevant to the event. Now, I came to this to kind of think about capitalism as an analytical category and its theory actually through the question of the revolution. My thesis was about Iranian revolution. And what was really interesting at the time when I was looking at the literature as a kind of heavily reconstructed Marxist, I was seeing that how there was this bizarre convergence between Marxist explanations or Iranian Marxist explanations of the revolution and actually the Islamists who carry out the revolution or benefited from it. They both argued that the revolution was highly exceptional. It was unique. And one side celebrated this uniqueness in terms of authenticity and something normatively positive, typical kind of post-colonial, decolonial kind of discourse we have, especially about Global South. And the other side, broadly the leftist and Marxists, saw it as a pathological exception. Why would a modern revolution produce a theocratic state? I mean, this just doesn't add up with anything Marx ever kind of imagined about the course of modern history. So as I studied more on revolution, it turned out actually Iran wasn't quite that exception. Political Marxists, including my colleague Ben Oteshke, who is a prominent figure with this literature, of course argue that French Revolution, the ideal type of all bourgeois revolutions, was not actually bourgeois at all. In fact, France was a pre-capitalist society. The whole revolution was a reaction to the pressure of English capitalism. So what we had was really an intra-class kind of struggle exploding in revolution. So really French Revolution is not a model of revolutions on which to assess any other modern revolution, since it wasn't really bourgeois at all. And then, of course, you have the Russian Revolution. How come, like the least industrially developed country of Europe is the site of the first workers' revolution in history? Again, it was so kind of astonishing for many Marxists, even at the time, that Gramsci had to write a piece called Against Capital, because it was so against the kind of premises of theory of kind of capitalist modernity you find in classical Marxism. And then, of course, you have, again, in a Chinese case, a communist party ruling over the most advanced capitalist economy in the world. You have fascism in Germany, the most advanced capitalist economy of the time, ruled by an aristocratic agrarian kind of elite. So all of these were actually exceptional, but exceptional against what? Well, the implicit reference is English capitalism most of the time. And of course, then that brought me rather more into intense engagement with political Marxism, because there you have one of the most profound kind of accounts of origins of capitalism, in the sense that political Marxists like Ellen Wood, Robert Brenner, James Communal, and others actually show that despite what many classical Marxists and orthodox Marxists believed, Marxists, or not believed, but maybe implied occasionally, that Marx's project wasn't to posit a critical political economy to the bourgeois economists' kind of mystificatory political economy. That wasn't at all. Actually, what Marx was trying to do was to show that the very thing we call economy, the very site, the very sphere of society which is called economy, is actually a product of a particular kind of configuration of social relations. And in that sense, what Marx was trying to do was to actually socialize the very idea of a kind of supra-social terrain called market or economy. This was quite eye-opening in the sense that it kind of showed light on, for me, on the very specificity of capitalism as a configuration of social relations, but also in the insistence on the fact that despite what bourgeois economists and liberal theoreticians believe, there is no such a thing as separation of the economy and the political, the state and the market. In fact, these are differentiation within the same totality, which is the social reality itself. And of course, Marx himself is quite explicit. In German ideology, he talks about capitalism as a mode of life, rather than usual description of mode of production. So that gave me something about what is so specific about capitalism, which is really about what Marx discusses under the so-called primitive accumulation, the separation of the direct producers from the means of production. And this is why suddenly social reproduction becomes a voluntary sale of kind of labor in the market, which makes exploitation contractual, which is a historically unprecedented kind of event up to the time at least. And that also means that the state can actually retreat from the immediate sphere of production and act as a separate arena of political struggle and so on. And of course, the political Marxists have a theory of this rise of capitalism in England. It's based on, again, the primitive accumulation and the concurrent kind of market dependency of direct producers and so on. So far, so good. What actually became problematic for me later was the theory of capitalist development premised upon the observations which Marx himself also kind of made on the rise of capitalism in England. And this is crucial because you might say, what's going on? This is event about Iran, you're talking about England. But I think here I'm gonna use or misuse Kayvan's statement about that actually, if you want to write capitalism into Iran, you have to start from European history, because almost every work in the Iranian studies takes for granted certain specific definitions and theorization of what capitalism actually is and how it develops. So there is no escape. And this is, you also see in the works like, Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, is of course is a plea for decolonization of actually social science itself. And yet it has to start from Marx and from European kind of theories of modernity and so on. So to extrapolate from English experience and kind of formulate theory of capitalist development has its own liabilities. And of course, you can see this in Brenner's own comparative analysis of France and England, on which he's trying to show how development in the countries were very different, and that's how English specificity was kind of thrown into light. And what here was really important was for me post-colonial critiques of the internalist thrust of Brenner's account of English capitalism and its origins. So people like Blount and others show that how colonial plunder, slavery, slave trade, and so on, they did play a role in the so-called primitive accumulation and so on. And you can't really have a theory of capitalist development without including the rest of the world into it. Now, of course, this debate is very wide. You have this great divergence debate and people who show that, okay, so why not Spain? Why not Portugal? They had earlier kind of slave trade and so on. Why specifically England? And then again, primitive accumulation becomes very key. Nonetheless, I think at the theoretical level, for me, it was quite problematic to formulate a series of concepts and theories about capitalism in abstract terms on the basis of the historical experience of a singular society, which nevertheless, as we all know, without being an expert, was embedded in a series of global and international relations, geopolitics being very prominent among these kind of relations. So given that capitalism does not emerge and has not emerged simultaneously everywhere, there is always a moment in time that a country was capitalist, in this case England, if you take Marx's kind of account, where the other ones were not. And the relation between these two, capitalist and non-capitalist polities, ought to have some sort of bearing on the way in which capitalism did develop from its epicenter of emergence in England. So I dealt with this question in terms of internalism, of which I have argued in my work that Eurocentrism is a very particular instance, because you can have Sinocentrism. You have emerging literature in China, which is centered around China. You might have Russocentrism, depending on kind of their weight in global history and so on. But all of these are internalist in the sense that they construct their general categories by reference to the internal dynamics of a given polity. And in so doing, immediately they actually elide and theoretically neglect the axis of relation, usually causal and constitutive, in fact, empirically can be demonstrated, between multiple societies existing in real time. So that's how I thought, one can actually have better explanation as to why a socialist revolution in a peasant society, why a fascist kind of state in an advanced capitalist economy, why an Islamic revolution or Islamic state in a relatively modernized, industrialized country like Iran in 1979, because here the capitalism is not the product of a series of prerequisites who have to be somehow internally accumulated to kind of sustain a capitalist sociality, but actually usually it's introduced from the above by the ruling elites, which find themselves under pressure of an externally existing capitalist state whose pressure is geopolitically mediated, usually through colonial expansion and encroachment, for which then non-capitalist actually social elites introduce capitalist social relations from above. And this has really profound implications for class structure, as well as class struggle, the nature of the state, because as Trotsky famously puts, in latecomer societies, bourgeoisie is an offspring of the state. It's not a social class emerging out of a kind of slow, gradual evolution and struggle in the countryside through enclosures and so on, as the English case was. So I don't know how many minutes is left, but I think basically what I have been trying to say to this point, that I think there is a specifically international dimension to social reproduction, including capitalism as a mode of social reproduction, which is neglected systematically in the tradition of classical social theory from Durkheim onwards, through Marx and Weber and almost everyone. Everybody recognizes the international as empirically relevant, but few people actually articulate what does it mean theoretically, what constitutiveness, what causality it's implicated in the fact that capitalist development takes place via the agency of non-capitalist states, whether it's the Qajar Iran or Pahlavi, first period of Pahlavi regime and so on, or Tsarism in Russia, or major restoration in Japan. In all of this, you have actually capitalism introduced from above in response to external contingencies and kind of exigencies. Now, I want to...
I'm sorry, but you were just a few minutes over, and I was
okay. Okay. 30 seconds. So before I finish, I just want to clarify one thing before I. Hopefully, in the question and answer, I can return to the question, but to the issues I wanted to mention. Kevin mentioned connections, and of course, the world is connected. Everything is connected. So what? And he's absolutely right. But the approach I am kind of utilizing, and even in combined development, is not about connection as such. It's not about global relations. It's not about transnational connections. It's specifically about international relations. And that in the sense that transnational phenomena are those which emerge despite political fragmentation of the world, whereas international phenomena are the ones which emerge because of the political fragmentation of the world. And these two are very different things. So while the two are kind of accommodated within the frame of uneven and combined development, but within my own work is the international, which is specifically prominent. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I apologize for having to cut you short.
No, it's fine.
Hopefully we can revisit in the upcoming questions and discussion. So Professor Rudy Maché, whenever you're ready, I think you have an interesting sort of counterpoint on this. So
yes, I think I feel like the Grinch who will steal Christmas. I come reluctantly to this panel, in part because I usually don't deal with the 20th century in Iranian history, but also because I grapple with the definition. I haven't heard much by way of definition. I think it's important to have some clarification about a definition because, you know, unless you want to use capitalism as this Procrustean notion, which, you know, you can apply it from the Roman Empire until today and across the world, and then it loses its explanatory value and its organizing principle value and so forth. I think it's important to have at least some ingredients that are necessary, that are inherent in it in order, again, to make it into a useful principle. And they do have to do, as far as I'm concerned, with the idea of private property and the security of it to some extent, and, you know, contracts and responsive markets and government support and so forth, you know. All these things, I think, go into capitalism because otherwise, again, you know, 12 people get killed these days and they call it a genocide. You know, it's a term that has completely lost its value and its explanatory value. So I think it's important to first state that. And when we subscribe, or when I subscribe to these ingredients, so to speak, I do have to come to the conclusion that Iran was a pre-capitalist society, really until the 20th century. I can't put it any other way. You know, I mean, I am not into triumphalism. I think it's actually, you know, becoming quite clear that capitalism is about to destroy the planet. So far be it from me to be triumphalist about capitalism. But it is, for me at least, again, a bit of a vicious cycle. You know, I mean, you start in Europe. Where else do you start? Again, when you infuse the notion with these ingredients, and then you don't even have to have a totally internalist perspective, because I mostly do in the case of Iran, but not exclusively. And I'm certainly not instinctively an internalist. You know, I have a full eye for, you know, the external and extraneous influences and sometimes the domineering ones. And I have read the literature, by the way, Kevan, about, you know, the new literature. I have read, you know, Sven Beckert and, you know, Dutch war capitalism and, you know, of course, the great divergence debate and all that. But I can't just get away from this vicious cycle somehow. That, you know, you either end up extrapolating or you end up getting into some kind of diversion, looking for capitalism in the Roman Empire because there was capital, right? Or you look for the absence of bitumen resources in China as an explanation of why China didn't develop the way Britain did, and so forth. And I think these are all diversionary tactics in a way. So you either, as far as I'm concerned, end up with the Procrustean, meaning a useless concept, or you throw the whole concept out, and then what? What are you going to use? Okay, so that by way of introduction. Now, I don't want to, you know, list the points that I made in the article that I wrote, and then I sort of repeat in my comments here, because I think they're all fairly clear and straightforward. We can talk about them, you know, because I do think, and I think it's just a fact, quite frankly, that the state wasn't very supportive. The Qajar state was, you know, kind of absent in a way, and in a way it's even obstructionist and, you know, wasteful. And you know, the judicial system was rather opaque, and Iran didn't have a lot to offer for budding capitalists. And it was an archipelago of oases with long distances, no density of population, large nomadic population, everything that militates against the introduction of capitalism, which is not to demonize Iran at all, or much less to pathologize, because that's the other thing that I would like to clarify, you know, far be it from me. But as a historian, I have to stick to the facts. You know, I'm not Willem Floor, you know, just the facts and nothing else. but vulgar non-Marxism, so to speak. But I don't know what else to say about it. What I do want to bring out, and I spent some a whole paragraph on this because I think it's very important. Actually, two things. One is that the physical environment does play an enormously important role in the case of Iran, especially. It's not deterministic, it never is, but it does play a much larger role than it gets to be acknowledged by almost everyone. The long distances, the mountain ranges, the fact that Iran is virtually a landlocked country. Persian Gulf doesn't provide ready access until motorized maritime traffic. India is closer than Iran, and certainly the Ottoman Empire. I always put it this way: if you wanted to introduce a printing press to Istanbul, modernization, right? You put it on the ship in Marseille, you sail for 4 days, and you're in Istanbul. You unload the damn thing at the dock, right? Try that for Iran in the 1860s, right? You either have to go to Russia overland. I mean, it's an absolute horror, right? Or you have to go around the Cape before the Suez Canal. And then you get first to India, of course, because of the monsoon winds. And then you have to go to the Persian Gulf. And then you have to unload the damn thing, which weighs 1,200 kilos. And then you have to transport another 600 miles to Isfahan, much less Tehran. So if you begin to, conceptualize these things, it adds a whole new dimension, I think, to capitalism of whatever definition. So I think not to be disregarded. The other one, I think, and this is about the developmental part of it, which is not to be confused with teleological, but if you move from the Safavid period to the early 20th century, you're faced with this black hole called the 18th century, which we are desperate to fill, and there are some impulses now. But so far, it is mostly chaos, warlords running around, Nader Shah, tribal, this and that. And Iran loses touch with the world in a crucial age where things radically change, both technologically and in terms of ideas about governance, mostly coming out of Europe, but not exclusively, right? I mean, the whole South American revolution that ultimately leads to independence in the early 19th century, bruised in the 18th century. Iran is completely absent, and again, it's not about deficiency in as such, it's not about pathologizing. These are just facts. I mean, Iran, no one goes to Iran. It's a poor country. It comes out of the 18th century in a bedraggled, very vulnerable state. It's not for nothing that the Russians trounced the Iranians and take a big chunk of its territory. So, these things also matter, I think. And again, this is not to present a negative image at all. Maybe we need a new vocabulary. And we're also, I think we should get away from these sort of dynastic blocks, right? The Qajars, the Pahlavis, and so forth. I was at a similar Zoom meeting a couple of days ago where, what is his name? Nader Sayadi spoke, who's written a dissertation about, Kashan, 18th century. A very interesting approach. Instead of just talking about the 18th century and 19th century as, famine after famine and, horror after horror, invasion and mortality, and then the looms all, disappear from 8,000 to 800, all of which is true, of course. He takes the terrible earthquake of 1778 as his centerpiece. And he looks at that as sort of the hinge. Thriving city before, 30,000 people die, and the city revives within a couple of years in remarkable ways. How? Why? Enormous entrepreneurship, civic responsibility. There's a sense of coming together somehow. Now, I think that's a great project. And it maybe has nothing to do with capitalism, but I think it's a great contribution to Iranian history without the pathology. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Mazir, if you could just round us out whenever you're ready to start your comments, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you very much. Not much is left for me to say. Much of what I would say is basically in conversation with Rudy, although my general claim might come across in opposition, but it's not as such. As everyone discussed capitalism in Iran is usually discussed in terms of exceptions, obstacles, barriers, and similar like pathological approaches. One popular theme currently in discussing current capitalist or non-capitalist relations in Iran is to compare current political economic order with the Qajar era feudal system or fiefdom or tuyuldari or suyurgal, in which the king would give royal endowments to military commanders and senior bureaucrats or other locally influential people to use a land, and those people would subcontract this land to other agents who in turn might even subcontract it, and the peasants were exploited. And this system is sometimes said to be one of the obstacles of the capitalist development in Iran. It is short-termist, it doesn't help capital accumulation. And some argue, like many economic newspapers, if you just Google tuyuldari, that today we in fact have tuyuldari, and it's more or less like the Kayvan's subcontractor state, where there are entities and individuals who, thanks to their connection with the government, they can have monopolies over industries and businesses or exports and imports, and they then subcontract these activities, and they just want to exploit as much value as fast as they can. And similarly to the tuyuldari, it's just about rent seeking and extraction of value as quick as possible, and it hampers capital accumulation, and they take the money to Canada, whatever. The claim that I want to make is that this comparison between today, political economic order, and Qajar era is possible because already in Qajar era, there are seeds of capitalist development that make this comparison possible. We can think of tuyuldari as something similar to today, not because today we have pre-capitalist relations that is a bit nonsensical, but because in Qajar era, some capital, like late 19th century at least, there are seeds of capitalist development that, of course, they don't dominate the whole economy and the whole sphere of organizing power relations until like late Reza Shah period. Like that's not the claim I want to make, but these institutions and techniques, capitalist techniques, are introduced already. What I mean by capitalist institutions and techniques, it goes to the question of what is capitalism. Here, I want to engage with the problem of political economy, that it almost never delivers the promise of in the political economy. Constantly, economic determinism is reproduced one way or another in the critical political economy. Even Brenner, who builds on Thompson, who is political Marxist, he is himself accused of being economistic in his other studies by my supervisor, Samuel Nafo and Beno Teşke, that Kamra mentioned. The reason behind this economistic deficiency of political economy as a discipline is that it's hostage to a productionist notion of capitalism. And it it cannot liberate itself from the understanding of capitalism as a mode of industrial relations. In contrast to this understanding, which heavily relies on understanding society in terms of the predominant technology of production, if we understand capitalism as a social technology, as not something that governs the relations between peoples and machines, but something that governs and regulates relations between people, then we can reformulate our understanding of early modern Iran and other societies. Just to elaborate, what is capital? Is it the bulldozer? Is it the machine? It's not, because you can have machines in non-capitalist production, non-capitalist economies. It's what makes an economic order capitalist or not is this dimension for private competition for monetary. It's a self-referential framework for private competition over monetary interest. If you have monetary money markets, if you have the legal technologies that connect value to future, then these are basically capitalist technology. These are what makes an economy capitalist or not. Like this is why Italian city-states before England, they had mercantile capitalism, right? If we look at the late 19th century Iran, we see such developments. Like we have Softe, we have Kargozars, agents who want to manage foreign trade. And these, as Rudy, I think in his works shows, these are not introduced by external forces. They are responses to external pressures, and they are responses that are moving towards a capitalist order. And the very fact that you have the rise of Bazaar in Qajar era as a social force is because Bazaar means market, right? How the Bazaar, the merchants, emerge as this powerful social force. It is because of expansion of marketization, and it is because they gain power with loans, often with high interests in these last decades of the 19th century. And this shows the monetization of relations, etc. Another dimension is the turn to cash crops and cotton, opium, and tobacco. Later, Reza Shah builds on this and uses the cash crops to build the national rail by taxing sugar. And it intensifies agriculture in a way that it damages agriculture, so, which is already something you can argue is a capitalist phenomenon. This is possible because already the turn to cash crops and intensification of agriculture had happened in decades prior to Reza Shah's rise. And I think I close my one.
You still have another minute or two if you'd like to conclude, Maziar, but yeah, if you feel like that's a good stopping point for you as well, that's not a problem. Yeah, okay. So I just have a few questions for the three of you, but also for the whole group. I'm curious to hear Professor Mate kind of converse more with with Kamran and others, and see how you would respond to this argument, right? That okay, sure, you can take 18th century Iran as a sort of container on its own and analyze, not entirely, but largely the dynamics internal to it. But what do you make conceptually, historically? I mean, and you do know the history of this period undeniably, better than I think any of us here too, to this notion that, sure, okay, Iran on its own terms in this period might very well be characterized as pre-capitalist, right? But the development, the emergence of capitalism elsewhere, I think, as Professor Martin was saying, occurs through the agency, or I think in another formulation of it would be through the underdevelopment of Iran, right? I know in your statement, your elaboration of this, you say that it's hard to make a strictly causal argument for that, right? That's not really how either Russia or Britain is relating to Iran in this period. But I wonder, yeah, again, on just a sort of more conceptual level, how that argument against this notion of not even necessarily describing Iran as pre-capitalist, but being able to do so only by sort of isolating it from these other pockets of development sits with you. That's one question I have, but also to take, I think, the inverse of that question and turn it on Kamran and Maziar, I'm curious to hear both of you sort of elaborate on this notion of capitalism as a sort of social formation primarily, not as a mode of production. I think maybe this is an attempt to bypass what might be a normative understanding of production, right? Although I think that I wonder why that impulse is, because as I understand it, the idea of productive labor is not a moral or normative term for Marx, but a strictly technical one to differentiate labor that does produce surplus value from forms that do not, right? So it seems like you guys have put yourself in maybe a self-imposed corner saying that there is this productionist notion of capitalism, and we don't quite see it manifesting in Iran in any of these sort of time periods that we're discussing, at least not in ways that it might, in places that might be called properly capitalist, whatever that may mean. So again, I'm just asking what the sort of conceptual work of thinking of capitalism or defining it primarily as a social formation, as a mode of, instead of a mode of production, does for you, since again, I think the two are actually the same as I understand them, right? A mode of production is the sum total of these sort of social relations that you're pointing towards. So it seems like there might be somewhat of a slippage there. And then I think questions that I have for everyone, it seems like we're operating on multiple levels of abstraction. And I think one of the primary ones is like where we're sort of talking in circles about what should the proper unit of analysis be here, right? And I think again, this tension comes out to the forward when hearing Professor Martin and Mate talk, right? Because I think, yeah, again, as I was sort of saying, it's like, sure, you can call Iran capitalist, but that's because you've taken the wrong unit of analysis as your starting point. And if you sort of telescope out to the world, you'll see that the pre-capitalism of Iran is constitutive of the capitalism elsewhere, of any elsewhere, right? So that's, I think, one question I think is worth maybe meditating on in the form of a conclusion. I think as well, I'm sort of interested in, a more fundamental question that I think is wrapped up in that, which is, what are we trying to accomplish when we describe something as capitalist and when we don't? I would be curious, Professor Mate, to know, about some of the opposition that I'm sure you've encountered, right? I'm sure there are charges that like this is rhetorically, empirically, this is a Eurocentric argument, right? But how does the Eurocentrism then really appear in these arguments and say, I think, as you're saying, it's not really a normative argument you're making. So why does it then sort of transfer into that register. So those are a few sort of big questions I have, and I hope others feel free to pose whatever thoughts have surfaced for them to different participants as well. And you know, the audience is welcome to share their thoughts in the chat, and hopefully we'll have time to get to, if not all, then most of those different threads.
So why don't we start with why don't we start with hearing comments from Kamran, Rudy, and Maziar, and then proceed from there.
Sorry, so you want me to go first and respond?
You guys don't have to go in the order you presented, but if you feel ready.
Yeah, well, sort of. I'm never ready, but that means I will even speak longer, which is not good. So basically, I think the problem is not to call Iran pre-capitalist when it's not capitalist. I would totally agree with Rudy. You know, you can't call something which is not displaying some basic properties, whether you define it in terms of machinery or social relationships. I think it should be possible to diagnose it. I think what one needs to or has to increasingly kind of recognize is the kind of teleological implication of pre and post kind of fixes. So I always have to have a footnote in my whatever I write, that this doesn't mean that I think this comes after that and has to be kind of sequence and so on and so forth. It's simply kind of a appreciation of the fact that this particular society is not socialist, not capitalist. I think that the issue arises when actually the society, based on whatever definition you have, seems to be capitalist, but it's not the good capitalism or the capitalism we recognize. So at least since land reforms, Iran has had experienced primitive accumulation. There is separation of direct producers. There is marketization and commodification of labor and everything, basically, nature as well as everything else. And yet, how different Iranian experience of capitalist modernity is from, if you take the European case, which is supposed to be the classical one, or from even the non-European ones, such as Japan or China. It's very peculiar. I think it's when we try to explain this specificity, when the questions of exceptionalism and discourse of prerequisites and barriers and pathology and so on usually creeps in. And in that sense, actually, even those accounts, they can actually make an explicit claim that they are not normative. They are simply describing the situation that does not exist, this and that, right? But the issue is how you explain this. It's not, the description is good so far as it goes, but then we have to have a theoretical accommodation and a kind of analytical explanation of the fact that Iran in 2022 is fully capitalist in social relations, and yet, as Omid was saying, you know, you have non-capitalist production, but a very strong capitalist elite or kind of class constellation. Why? How can we explain that? And I think at that point, at least, my contention is that you can't really explain it internally based on dynamics internal to Iran, which after all is a modern phenomenon. What is Iran? Where it starts, where it ends? You know, it's when we talk about Iran or any country, we usually have the modern nation state form of these countries in mind, which kind of has a kind of casts a long shadow on its past as well. Regarding what we mean by the social formation conception of capitalism, Bita, I think social formation is slightly different. That's what Althusser and others were using, or Laclau, to talk about multiple modes of production existing within the same space. It's a kind of articulation of modes of production. What I mean, in my case at least, I don't know what Maziar thinks, capitalism is a social totality in the sense that precisely the political, which Maziar was saying, is absent from political economy accounts of Iran. That actually, if let's say, let me use a very crude orthodox Marxist kind of discourse, if Iran's base is capitalist, why is it the superstructure so peculiarly different? And I think that question arises only because we presuppose the two are different and one determines the other. Whereas I have learned from Ellen Wood and others, or maybe they didn't mean it in that way, but that's what I take from them, that actually the political is constitutive of what those relations are. And in that sense, I would say actually the great variety of capitalist modernity from China to Japan to Tsarist Russia to Iran and so on, actually explicable much better at the level of the polity, as at the level of geopolitical formation, as well as state formation, which is why actually you can have same relations of wage labor, abstract kind of individual or commodification of this and that, and yet the totality of that polity displays a very distinct properties, which is not deducible or reducible to what happened in England in 15th, 16th century, nor to France in 1789, nor to Germany in 1930s. It's just kind of almost sui generis and yet totally interactively developed with those experiences. And we can't really even recognize those dynamics if we have an internalist frame of reference, because we are already operating within the universe of that polity, which is already constituted by something extra to itself. So I think I will stop there.
Am I next?
If you'd like to be.
Sure. Okay. A couple of things about the 18th century again. I think it's so interesting because it comes after a period, the Safavid period, which shows you some really interesting and fascinating preconditions for capitalism, an interventionist state in the positive sense of the word in some ways, certainly under Shah Abbas I, you know, who takes care of infrastructure, has a vision about connecting his country to the world. And Iran is very well connected to the world by 1700, right? Safavid state falls for all kinds of reasons. That's not the topic here. And then it falls into chaos. And Kamran's point, by the way, that he just made, that, you know, we tend to talk about Iran as if it's a nation state by 1750, and it isn't. It's a conglomerate of tribal fiefs and domains. It's the plateau. So there is no national economy. There was never a national economy, by the way, until really far into the, in some ways, until the 20th century, in some ways, you know, with all kinds of repercussions, you know, famine in one part of the country and 100 miles beyond an abundance. So how do you deal with that? How do you explain that in terms of capitalism? So then in the 18th century, again, not to repeat myself, but I think it's very consequential. We live in a kind of a parallel universe. You know, Iran is cut off from the world in many ways. People don't go to Iran, Westerners. Very few Iranians have any contact with the West. You know, there are a couple of people end up going to India in the last part of the century and come back with strange stories about the British, you know, operating there. But that's about it, as far as we know, in terms of documentation, in terms of sources. But again, the 18th century is consequential for, you know, many, many things. After the 19th century, I think it's the most dramatic century in terms of transformative change. And it begins in Europe, no matter how you look at it, you know, that sort of, you know, irreversible, irresistible conglomerate of political and economic and social ideas. All that is generated somehow in the 18th century. Even the antecedents to capitalism, Adam Smith goes back to the 18th century. Iran is not part of that conversation, no matter how you look at it. By the way, you know, I don't know, this may generate some more debate, you know, talking about the origins of capitalism. You know, I'm a great fan of Joel Mokyr, you know, this notion of applied knowledge and you know, an appreciation for labor, for manual labor, a validation of that, as opposed to, you know, metaphysical speculation, which is very dominant in not just Iran, but in many parts of the non-European, non-Western European world. And not to be disregarded, I think, as a very important component for exactly that transformation that takes place.
So let me, I mean, just kind of, you know, some further thoughts on what Rudy's saying. I mean, the point of origin, you know, this whole notion of origin, I mean, you know, it kind of concurs. I mean, even maybe earlier, you know, this kind of like development of capitalism. Yeah, it kind of maybe originates in Europe, but with the conquest of Americas, and then, you know, the process of colonization and the slave trade, and, you know, transformation of, I don't know, Caribbean into a sugar colony, and, you know, silver production, you know, in South America. I mean,
Yeah,
it's you know, the narrative of Europe at the center has to also include, you know, like the incorporation as unequal, you know, through plunder or, you know, commodification and, you know, domination of all these other parts. I mean, these are tangled histories, but obviously there's a hierarchy in it, which, yeah, okay, you know, Europe is at the core of it, but then, you know, it also, without, you know, without Indonesia, you know, becoming, you know, the space center, you wouldn't have the, you know, the golden 17th century of the Netherlands, you know, which, you know, predates England actually in some ways, you know, the Low Countries. But, you know, in the case of Iran, you know, I also want to say this, that I completely agree with the necessity of empirical analysis and historical analysis. I mean, you know, in fundamental ways, it's oil revenues, for example, you know, and the oil industry that kind of like allows the knitting together of the territory of Iran, you know, I mean, and like, you know, bringing, you know, all these like transformations. But the problem is that when we look at, you know, oil, I mean, in the Iranian literature, I mean, I think it was, I don't know, Kayvan mentioned it, or who mentioned it before? I mean, like this whole paradigm of rentier state, and, you know, the whole like nature of the Iranian state has been shaped by its revenues from oil. But oil has never been a mere source of revenue, you know, monetary revenue to, you know, to the state. It's been a fabric of social life. I mean, it's knitted a geography, it's created, you know, and a whole, you know, set of, you know, cities and infrastructures and, you know, demographic shifts, you know, in terms of populations and dispossessed nomads and, you know, commodification of labor and so on and so forth, right? So there's an entry point, you know, which with Iran begins with this like resource that actually kind of begins to like put Iran on the geopolitical map in a way that it wasn't before, right? I mean, at the turn of 20th century, at this like key moment, especially the First World War, right? But then when we look at oil, you know, and, you know, well, how it, you know, how oil capitalism came to shape Iran, we go back to the point that Kamran was making that I don't disagree with at all, you know, that, yeah, the state, you know, 90% of the time, it's the state that actually creates a political economy. It creates classes. I mean, the whole process of, you know, the white revolution and the land reform was the state kind of stepping in and dispossessing, you know, the old landed, you know, aristocracy and landlords and creating a whole, you know, two separate classes of small landowners and then commercial landowners and then dispossessed, you know, former, you know, villagers that were part of an agrarian economy. So yeah, the state makes this, creates this process. There are like material elements to it, you know, like the, you know, like the whole emergence of, you know, oil, you know, as an industry. But then also, if you look at, I mean, going back to this question of local and global, and how they're kind of interconnected. I mean, without Iranian labor, without Indian labor, without you know, Iranian oil, you know, this whole transition to, you know, and then, you know, oil from, you know, Romania and you know, Mexico and so on and so forth, this whole global transformation of capitalism would not have been possible. You know, we tend to, you know, in some narratives, you know, which we all kind of touched upon one way or another, you know, in some narratives, we tend to think that where corporations are, you know, like located, where powerful global states are located, which kind of like shape, you know, these economies, these global networks for their own, you know, primary interests, you know, they're kind of like the drivers of history. And in some ways they are, you know, without a doubt, right? But then at the same time, you know, the question is that if we want to kind of like say that, you know, the oil capitalism was was initiated by, you know, by Britain or by Europe, and, you know, we've been just like sitting aside and, you know, sitting on the side and just, you know, resources being produced on this territory, and otherwise we've just been suppliers and no actors in any way. I think we're also missing a very significant part of that empirical history. These are intertwined. So I don't think, I agree that 19th century, I completely agree that, like 19th century, 18th century, certainly, it's very difficult to kind of, and it's not even necessary to kind of think of Iran in terms of, capitalism being an operative category. But from the turn of 20th century, and this kind of integration through the network of the global war, world war, and, discovery of oil, and this transformation of the whole global economy based on fossil fuels in a different way, I don't think we can imagine Iran not to have been part of that global, network of capitalism, but then also capitalism being, built, through infrastructure, commodification of labor, dispossession of, peasants and nomads, like eradication of local autonomy, imposition of nationwide property laws and contractual laws, and a monetary economy. I mean, a real that kind of, prior to 1914, like you have currencies. I mean, Rudy has written about this, in a profoundly important book, we don't have a national currency. I mean, Khuzestan, people use rupees, Indian rupees, because, there's like real is irrelevant, and it takes, let alone, print, Rudy mentioned the example of a printing press being brought to Iran. Taking it from, taking a printing press from Bushehr or from Mohammad or Khorramshahr to Tehran would have taken much longer than, transporting it from, Europe or Belgium or wherever it was, it was manufactured, all the way through the oceans, to the shores of Iran. Internal transportation was impossible. It's after that it's constructed. Can you think of Iran after that period as anything but part of that global capitalist economy is the question that I want to pose.
Can I comment quickly about this?
Yeah, can I
Go, Kamran, you can.
I was also
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry,
please.
I would just like to invite the audience if they have any questions or comments, because I know that the event's time is technically ended, but I would like us to be able to sit and continue chatting among ourselves. But if the audience would like to put any questions in the chat, we could I could bring those up to participants, but you should go ahead in the meanwhile.
Yeah, regarding this last point Kaveh made, I think I would like to actually come to Rudy's defense, if that's okay. I think it's one thing to say that a country like Iran is capitalist by virtue of being part of division of labor of capitalism globally, which is what Wallstein and Wolf system theories would say. It's other thing to say that Iran is capitalist because the so-called primitive accumulation, as Marx describes it in Capital, has taken place. These are two different things. One is a sociological form of capitalism, i.e. social relations have fundamentally changed within that polity. The other one is a functional definition of what dependency theory and others have discussed. In that sense, yes, I mean, almost any country is already sort of capitalist by virtue of being in a world which is dominated by English capitalism since 16th, 17th century onwards. And I think that's not analytically very productive in a sense. The other, and two quick other points I would like to make. One is this notion of rentier state actually reminded me, because every time I teach rentier state in my class, of course, Norway comes up. So how come Norway is so different from Iran or Saudi Arabia and so on? And that, I think, brings up the question of historical sequence, which internalist approaches repress. It does matter historically at what point in time a country embarks upon capitalist industrialization. If you are Germany under Bismarck in 1860, it makes a huge difference. Or if you are kind of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in 1962 in Iran. There are huge, and the reason is that capitalism has emergent properties. It reconstitutes its very context of emergence, and therefore categories derived from that emergence cannot explain subsequent forms of capitalist development because it's already influenced by its own very development. So Germany is influenced, let's say, by French revolutionary politics and English capitalism. Tsarism is already influenced by rise of kind of proto-Nazi kind of capitalism in Germany, and Iran and others already influenced by the combination of all these of prior kind of emergence of capitalism. So I think this temporal sensibility of historical sequence is really crucial in making sense of not only just capitalist development, but I would say state formation. It's extremely important whether you make your state in the absence of United Nations and the rules of sovereignty and external intervention and so on, or you're actually doing today like Russia, and you are kind of sanctioned within a week out of kind of global economy in a kind of in a very short period of time. So just those 2 quick points.